Jazz harmony is a huge topic, and learning to understand and analyze chord progressions can seem like an impossible task. But if you understand a few of the techniques involved, you can create beautiful chord progressions and have an easier time figuring out how to solo over them. And you can see those techniques being put to use on this chord progression that you probably already know. For this video, I'm going to use this turnaround as a starting point and show you how you can expand on it and change it to create some nice, surprising sounds. What is important to understand about the basic turnaround is that it's just an embellished version of a 1-5 progression, which you might know if you already followed some Barry Harris lessons. First thing to add is to turn the 5 into a 2-5, which is really just a glorified version of a G7 sus4 to G7. Then to add some extra movement, the A minor is added in the first bar, really just to keep the flow of having 2 chords per bar and a little bit more variation in there. This is the basic progression, and now you can start making variations of it. Along the way, you also want to realize that I don't really think in substitutions that much, simply because that's not a very useful way to use or understand harmony. The first variation that you want to add to the progression is a secondary dominant, in this case a way to get the progression to flow a bit more towards the D minor 7. The turnaround is in the key of C major, and the A7 is of course not the dominant in that key, that's G7. Like this, you're using the A7 to create a pull towards the D minor and add some movement to the chord progression. When the A7 appears like this, then it's described as a secondary dominant, so a dominant resolving to something else than the tonic of the key. Since the A7 is resolving to the D minor 7, then you can treat it as an A7 in D minor. And the logical scale choice is then D harmonic minor, making it an A7, flat 9, flat 13. You could essentially use the same principle to have a D7 resolving to G7. Can you see why the D7 is then not a D7 flat 9 flat 13? You can also take the secondary dominant and then turn it into the easy diminished chord. This is sometimes referred to as a secondary dominant diminished. This is really just an A7 flat 9 with a C sharp in the bass, and you will solo on it using the same material that you use on the A7, so D harmonic minor. The reason for using the diminished chord here is usually just to have a different type of bass melody. Later in the video, you'll also see some examples of the difficult diminished chord, which is a great example of why thinking in substitutions is going to make things more difficult. Of course, you can also start on a different chord than the C major 7. Other chords in the key have a tonic function, and the 3 chord is a beautiful option that also really highlights that the progression is still moving. We're going somewhere, we're not just ending on the tonic on the C major 7. Here you also want to notice that it sounds great to use a G7 that's borrowed from minor, so a G7 with a flat 9 and a flat 13. The flat 9 and the flat 13 become chromatic leading notes that help pull stronger towards the resolution back to C major 7. Let's have a look at the difficult diminished chord. The progression that I started with was C major 7, A minor 7, D minor 7 to G7, and then you can add more momentum by playing an A7 or a C sharp diminished chord in the second half of the first bar. I already mentioned that this was not really a substitution, but what does that mean? So when you talk about substitutions, then it's about taking one chord and replacing it with a related chord. But there's not really a connection between A minor 7 and A7 flat 9 in this progression. It makes more sense to just view that as a different way of getting from C major 7 to D minor 7. And that, I think, is also how you want to interpret and understand this example. The star of this example is the E-flat diminished chord. Now this diminished chord is an altered subdominant chord that resolves back to the more regular subdominant chord D minor 7. I have some older videos on this type of diminished chord, so if you want to dig deeper into the theory here, then you can check out those. I often come across people trying to turn these diminished chords into dominants that don't resolve, and personally I don't think that really helps me hear how the progression moves, so I like this analysis a lot better. There are two main things happening here. The first is that I'm extending how much is borrowed from C minor. So now the entire 2-5, so actually the entire second half of the progression is borrowed from C minor. Really a beautiful sound to have these minor cadences in major. But probably the most curious one is the first chord, which until now was reserved for a tonic chord like C major 7 or E minor 7. But now it's a secondary dominant, namely E7 going to A7 before going to the 2-5 and back to C major. The E7 is a secondary dominant that would resolve to A minor in the key. So you would also treat it like that and use a harmonic minor on it, which would give it a flat 9 and a flat 13. Choosing this as a turnaround is a way to emphasize the movement. So it's not so important that we have sort of the clear tonic sound. It's instead more important that we keep the song moving, for example, at the end of an A part going to the next A part. You will see an even more radical version of this later in the video. I already talked a bit about why substitutions aren't the best way to approach harmony, but this example has actually two clear examples of substituting chords with similar functions. Here you have the secondary dominant in bar 1, A7, being substituted with an E flat 7, which is the dominant that shares the same tritone interval, so the same core notes C sharp and G. The other substitution is using an altered dominant for the G7, which is a sound that's a bit further away than just borrowing from minor, and actually also kind of related to tritone substitutions. It's a great sound to create a lot of tension and movement towards the resolution back to the 1 chord. This turnaround variation is a great way to incorporate minor subdominants and Coltrane changes into a basic turnaround. Here you have the first 3 chords as being straight out of a Coltrane cycle in C major. Another way to look at this, and probably the reason why it sounds so great, is that it involves a beautiful minor subdominant chord, A flat major 7, which is the flat 6 in natural minor. The first 2 chords are similar to the previous example and sound similar to pretty much what we expect to hear in a turnaround. But then the E7 kind of takes a left turn and resolves as a 5 chord and not as a tritone substitution, which takes us to that A flat major 7, not the D minor 7. And this is really a nice but still satisfying detour. This turnaround is often referred to as a ladybird or a Ted Dameron turnaround, but not everybody agrees on what that exactly is, so it can be a good idea to just check when people say that they're playing that. In emergencies, when you're soloing, the blues always works. Let's step it up a bit and then add some chromatic chords. This one probably came from the diminished chord that I talked about earlier, but it really just is stepping out of the key and then approaching the D minor 7 from a half step above. Here you have the E flat minor 7 that just quickly jumps away from the key and then with parallel movement slides back into it. You'll find this quite often with people like Bill Evans, Jim Hall and Keith Jarrett, and they very often use this as a way to reharmonize diminished chords and then make parallel minor movement instead of that. Even Parker does this sometimes, so it may actually be coming from that. Again, calling this a substitution for a diminished chord is a bit of a stretch, but that is in a way of course also where you'll find it most of the time. Using a turnaround where the first chord is a surprise to the listener is always a great effect, and this example does exactly that. When the ear expects a C major 7 and then is suddenly thrown a B flat 7, then it still is acceptable because the B flat 7 moves on to the A7 quite quickly and then just continues in the turnaround. So the B flat 7 is of course just a tritone substitution of the E7, the secondary dominant for A7. So I don't think this turnaround is that common, but I really think it sounds great and you definitely should give this a try on a jazz standard as a reharmonization. You can create amazing things by taking songs and adding chords to them while also exploring different sounds and options with the chord progression. Now, if you want to explore how to make your own chord melodies and really put those two things together, then check out this video. It's a great way to build your knowledge and skills with jazz chords, and in the process, you get started making some beautiful chord melody arrangements.